Okay, next up, Richard Landes, who already met and everyone mostly knows, professor of history at Boston University, about to embark on his next stage of his career in life. Most famous for writing Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of Millennial Experience, The Paranoid Apocalypse, which is about the protocols of Elders of Zion, which I have a chapter in, and I was happy to do that. And currently a book, They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, a medievalist guide to the 21st century. It hasn't come out yet, but that's going to be interesting. Richard.
Thank you. Actually, the title of that book reflects a thought that occurred to me a number of times, but in one particular occasion occurred to me in the context of what Itamar was showing about Hamas, because being aware of their global ambitions, in 2009 during Operation Cast Lead, there were people chanting, led by George Galloway in London, people chanting, "We are Hamas, we are Hamas," and carrying signs saying, "We are Hamas." And I thought that, you know, if you had told one of the signers of the Hamas charter in 1988 that within 20 years infidels in Western capitals would be shouting, "We are Hamas," he probably would have responded, "Only Allah can make somebody that stupid." So that's the source of the title of my book. What I'd like to talk about today is to bring together some of the elements of what I've been referring to as active cataclysmic apocalyptic scenarios, which I'll argue are basically focused on a combination of demonizing the apocalyptic other, and the product of these kinds of destroy the world to save it movements is Megadeath. There are at least three major ones that we can point to. The Taiping movement, ironically called the Great Peace, which broke out in China in 1850 and ended with its elimination by the forces of the Qing dynasty in 1864, in other words, right around the time that the American Civil War is ending. Estimates are that between 25 and 30 million Chinese died in the process of that war for the Great Peace. The Bolsheviks of Russia are another example, somewhere around 20 million dead, and that doesn't count the dead as a result of the wars that they were involved in, just sort of what you could call auto-genocide. The Nazis, probably 40 million dead. The Communist Chinese, 65 to 85 million dead. The Cambodians, because the scale was so small, but the percentage was so high, another 2 million dead. Movements that believe that they are saving the world by destroying evil and believe that they are the agents whereby that evil should be destroyed I think that they represent far and away the greatest danger to mankind one can imagine. And when people talk about how religion has killed more people than anything else in this world, I think that by and large they're referring to people who are mobilized by these kinds of beliefs. And as my examples of both the Nazis and the communists point out, I don't believe that these beliefs are merely religious in the conventional sense, but that in fact groups that insist on their secular nature are as susceptible, if not more susceptible, to this kind of appeal, in some senses, because if you're religious and you believe in an omnipotent God, if you really do, you are much more likely to give some room for that God to do the things necessary to bring about the salvation of mankind. Whereas if you don't believe in God, if you're really purely secular, then the likelihood that you will feel that you yourself have to carry this out is even greater. So I'd like to talk briefly about the psychology involved in this cataclysmic scenario. And I think one of the aspects of it is that you view people who are in the grip of this notion that there has to be massive destruction in order for the remnant to be saved, have a pretty dim view of human nature. In other words, it's not possible for people to be transformed by a message of love or a message of salvation. The only way that you're going to be able to deal with the evil in the world is to kill those people you identify as evil. So there are passive forms of this belief. In other words, the rapture Christians believe that God's going to be doing the destroying, that he's going to rapture the people who deserve to be saved off the planet. Then come 7 years of terrible tribulation in which many people die. And then the saved will return to enjoy the millennium on earth. But when you believe that you are God's agent, you are God's weapon in bringing this about, it's a completely different set of dynamics. And by the way, this is a form of belief which is much more suited to the modern era than it was back in earlier times. My specialty is the year 1000, and nobody in the year 1000 believed that they could carry out the cosmic destruction described in the book of Revelation. That was obviously beyond them. By 1100, you've got the Crusades. They wade in blood. They're genocidal, certainly about the Jews in Europe, and they're proud of wading in the blood of their slain enemies as they enter Jerusalem, singing, "This is the day the Lord made. We will rejoice therein." So you have some elements of this sort of active cataclysmic, but it never can reach God obviously has to get involved in this because humans are incapable of this. But in an era of weapons of mass destruction, all of a sudden this becomes a much more viable option. So what happens when you're dealing with this kind of thinking? You're dealing with, among other things, a fierce hatred, a furious impatience with imperfection, with ingratitude, with deliberate misdeeds. Evil cannot be transformed, it must be exterminated. And here I'd like to quote a passage from a vision that Hung Shu-chuan, who was the founder of the Taiping movement, he had a vision. It came to him at a moment of utter humiliation when he failed the exam for the Mandarinate for the 4th time. And he almost died. He went into, a period of weeks where he was totally delirious. And in these visions, he actually ascended to heaven and met an old man whom he later understood was God. And he has this dialogue with him. God says to him, "All human beings in the whole world are produced and sustained by me. They eat my food and wear my clothing, but not a single one among them has heart to remember and venerate me. The worst is that they take my gifts and they worship demons. They purposely rebel against me." That element of purposefulness is very important. "They purposefully rebel against me and arouse my anger." After saying this, the old man gave Hung Shu-chuan a sword, commanding him to exterminate the demons, but to spare his brothers and sisters. He then led Hung Shu-chuan out and told him to look down and said, "Behold, the people upon this earth, 100-fold is the perverseness of their hearts." Hung Shu-chuan looked down and saw such a degree of depravity and vice that he was flabbergasted. And this is a man who will then essentially declare anybody who's an enemy a demon, and among other things, if it meant destroying a dam that would then flood a city of 1 million people, there was no problem with that, because anybody who wasn't with him was against him. So I use that to illustrate this sort of burning hatred that you have, this Manichaean worldview in which evil must be destroyed and the enemy is demonic. Another dimension of this kind of thinking is that it has enormous tendencies towards paranoia, which is a belief that the enemy is cosmic, that it's invisible. It's certainly invisible to other people. It's visible to us, we who believe. And in apocalyptic time, it's about to complete the full conspiracy. So we're just on the verge of the bad guys taking over and, in the case of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, enslaving all of mankind. So it's cataclysm versus cataclysm. The threat is ultimate and the response needs to be ultimate. And as a result, many of these people think in genocidal terms. And it's a defensive genocide. Either we exterminate them or they will exterminate us. In every case, these movements, when they took power, if they took power, fortunately it doesn't happen too often, although it's happened in the last centuries more often, these movements, when they take power with this belief, once they have identified the source of evil to be destroyed, they believe that in some sense the new Adam will emerge spontaneously from the destruction. So for the French revolutionaries, it was putting an end to legal inequality and the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, would produce a new citizen. For the Marxists, it was an end to private property, and that would produce the new comrade. And for the Nazis, it was the racially pure Aryan who would bring on the Tausendjährige Reich. And ironically for Zionists, the new sovereign Jew would put an end to anti-Semitism. In any case, all of these movements, and Zionism is not one of these destroy the world to save it, but all of these millennial movements start with this belief that somehow if you just get rid of the bad things, then the good will flourish. It will be a kind of natural flourishing. And what happens is every time that they take power and they inaugurate their program, they discover that human nature is considerably less cooperative than they expected. And one of the moves that they make, and this is the move into the Megadeath, is the belief that in some sense it's a move towards coercive purity. Now we must force people to be free, to use the expression of that democratic totalitarian Rousseau. And that means not just enemies have to be coerced, but even people on your own side. I mean, the French terror was directed against the French. It was not directed against their outside enemies, even though the French national anthem dreams of, the blood of their enemies running in the furrows like water. This, I argue, is in fact the totalitarian impulse that under certain circumstances can lead to megadeath, not just of enemies, but enemies amongst one's own people. Cambodia, precisely because it happened so late after the Holocaust and the Western vows of ni vida, never again, represents the terrifying potential embedded in such apocalyptic turns in millennial beliefs. Now, I'd like to turn to the issue of global jihad, which I see as one of these movements, and to talk about the way in which they have managed to spread many of their memes well beyond the circle of people who share these deep-seated set of beliefs. And in particular, we heard earlier about the left, the Green-Red Alliance, which I think is one of the more disturbing dimensions of the 21st century. The Jihadis have, with remarkable talent and success, managed to spread some of their memes to a much broader audience, as I remarked in terms of the case of infidels carrying signs, "We are Hamas." They have managed to actually enlist in their cause people who are in fact targets of their intentions for conquest. And I think that the way they have done this successfully, and this is the topic of this panel, is they've done this successfully through their ability to spread hatred of Jews, and in particular hatred of sovereign Jews, namely Israelis. This is certainly true within the Muslim world, as the Itamar's paper and other papers, well, Charles Small should have given a paper on this subject, indicate. On average, 98% of Muslims in Muslim majority lands, i.e. nations where the media, there are no or few and completely subjected Jews, and in which the population is subject to the media of a Muslim public sphere, 98% on average have hostile views of Jews. When people want to discuss the relationship between moderate Muslims and extremists, one of the most important areas of overlap happens to concern the attitude towards Jews. The highly adept and almost instantaneous use of bin Laden's use of the image of Muhammad Abdullah. He made a recruiting video for Global Jihad that had this really as one of the prime features of the video. And he did it within months of the incident. And it's presented that he's killed al-Yidei Yahud at the hands of the Jews. It widely accepted the world over as a case of IDF soldiers deliberately murdering a child in his father's arms to recruit for global jihad illustrates the point. Jew hatred not only sells, it draws to global jihad. In 1998, the Center for Millennial Studies held a conference entitled The Apocalyptic Other. In it, we explored two extremes, typical of the apocalyptic genre, which has a tendency towards extremes, of the ways that apocalyptic believers view each other. View the other, the apocalyptic other. At one extreme, what I call active transformative one, in which the other, the outsider, must be embraced and redeemed through love, while at the other, the one that we've been discussing so far, the other must be destroyed, exterminated. One might think these two attitudes cannot differ more, just as an apocalyptic millennial lover like Francis of Assisi differs from an apocalyptic millennial hater like Adolf Hitler. But in most versions, these two attitudes are directly related, with the favorable approach bringing outsiders into the movement, convert them, turning hostile with the disappointment at the failure. That others' rejection of the loving overture turns into apocalyptic scapegoating. My beliefs have failed because you rejected them. This, I would argue, is the core of Christian hostility to Jews, including, alas, Francis's followers, and we find them formally built into attitudes towards the inhabitants of Dar al-Islam. Summons, dawah, refused, triggers automatically conquest and jihad and conquest. But the postmodern world has produced a new mutation in this progressive, love and life-embracing, transformative apocalyptic scenario. Instead of loving the other in order to convert him, some progressives, at least in principle, accept the other as other, a kind of apocalyptic multiculturalism in which, at its limits, it adopts a radical cultural relativism. All cultures are equally valid, and we should not judge others. This radical multiculturalism that so embraces the apocalyptic other has somehow, in the course of this young century, produced a strange variety that has somehow made common cause with the most ferocious form of apocalyptic hatred. They did so over a shared hatred, Zionism, that is, the hatred of sovereign Jews. Ironically, the very same people who invoke the progressive meme, who are we to judge, when it comes to terrorism, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and even female genital mutilation, as Charles was talking about, suddenly turns to a ferocious negative judgments when it comes to Israel. I think one of the most astounding elements of the negative attitude towards so many people towards Israel is that these are people who in principle feel that you should judge only, if you judge at all, should judge only after a great deal of consideration, and you shouldn't jump in and so on. And yet the rapidity with which people seem to want to find Israel at fault is really quite astonishing. Based on my understanding of apocalyptic dynamics, In the mid-90s, I predicted an outbreak of anti-Semitism in 2000. As a medievalist, I noted that the upswing of transformative apocalyptic enthusiasm, Christians had taken positive attitudes towards Jews. This is even true of Martin Luther, primarily in the hope of converting them, and with disappointment had shifted to apocalyptic scapegoating in which the Jewish failure to convert had prevented Jesus from returning, thus making Jewish refusal the cause of the failure of their apocalyptic expectations. Given the longest sustained period of Philo-Judaism in the 3 millennia-long history of the Jews, from after the Holocaust to the end of the 20th century, especially in the USA, I thought that the source of a new wave would be those premillennial dispensationalist Christians who anticipated with such intensity the rapture of 2000, and which I was willing to bet wouldn't happen, and I was right. And when the millennium hit, it turned out I was right about the revival of anti-Semitism and wrong about its source. Even I, in my worst scenarios in the 1990s, never imagined that by 2015, prime ministers of Western European nations would openly discuss the danger that their countries might become Judenized. In part, my failure to understand just how far and wide this plague of scapegoating hatred would spread and was directly related to my mistake about its origin. The source of this new wave was well known to me, Muslim anti-modernism, or Islamism if we want to use that word, which welcomed the worst of Christian and Nazi anti-Semitic fantasies before, during, and after the Nazi delirium. The most virulent genocidal forms of these hateful fantasies appear in Muslim apocalyptic literature, and you saw some of the spin-off of that in Itamar's talk about the Palestinian Authority. The most virulent and genocidal forms of these hateful fantasies appear in Muslim apocalyptic literature, which views Israel as the Dajjal, the Antichrist, the supreme deceitful enemy who must be destroyed at the end of time. In their founding charter, Hamas has this genocidal hadith about the Muslims will kill the Jews and the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees. At one point, I was speaking with a reporter about this, and I said, it's an apocalyptic hadith, and his response to me was, it's not an apocalyptic hadith, everybody says it. What no one expected, myself as well, is that this apocalyptic hatred, the quintessence of noch wieder, yes again, would jump from the Muslim world to the Western world that was presumably guided by nie wieder, never again. October 2000 saw a new wave of the most appalling features of genocidal anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world, still greater urgency to the fear of the Elders of Zion conspiracy, new intensity and creativity in retelling blood libels and TV serials run during Ramadan, the hadith of the rocks and trees, so common that everyone says it. To those gripped with this feverish paranoia, the Jews are the most all-powerful manipulators who have already destroyed Christianity and now intend to destroy Islam. And in fact, they use not just the terms of destruction, but castration. In other words, they believe that the Jews have castrated the Christians, and now they want to castrate the Muslims. To those gripped with this feverish paranoia, the Jews were the right. Apocalyptic jihadis shared the Nazi view of Jews, exterminate or be exterminated. They wanted, and this is quoting a widespread expression in the Arab and Muslim world, finish the job that Hitler had begun. There's a wonderful sort of irony in Holocaust denial, in that you have the same people denying the Holocaust ever happened and then accusing the Israelis of behaving the way Hitler apparently didn't. Which brings me to my mistaken prediction. I thought Western Jew hatred would come from the religious right. Instead, it came overwhelmingly from the secular left. And as we shall see, that error in calculation meant that I severely underestimated the spread and damage of this new Jew hatred. We can date it quite specifically to October 1st, 2000, first among Muslims who started attacking Jews on October 1st. That is right in the wake of the dissemination of the picture of Mohammed Adoua allegedly killed in his father's lap by the Israelis. And then on October 6th, in Place de la République, at a rally that joined the Jihadi right and the progressive left, including a group called MRAP, which was an anti-racist group, shouting, brace yourself, death to Jews, for the first time in a European capital since the Holocaust. Unquestionably, this wave of vitriol responded to reporting about the Intifada. Most thought they reacted to what Jews did, whereas in fact they reacted to reports from a school of lethal journalists who systematically reported Palestinian lethal narratives about evil Israelis as news. The Adoura murder, the Jenin massacre, the Gaza open-air prison, the IDF's deliberate targeting of civilians and even children. And when these claims proved untrue, these lethal journalists mumbled corrections and moved swiftly on to the next lethal narrative, leaving cartoonists and NGOs and UN officials to carry on the tainted torch. But much more was involved. When Jew hatred became the public parlance of the schools, especially in what the French call the zone urbaine sensible, the neighborhoods that, sensitive neighborhoods, the response was concession after concession. Jews complained their children were being bullied. School principals told them to take their children out, leaving their schools filled with bullies. It was so bad that there's French slang. A beurre is an Arab, it's Arab backwards. And a feuge is a Jew, it's juif backwards, so it's sort of like Pig Latin. So at this point in the early aughts, if you said c'est un bic feuge, it's a Jewish pen, it means it's broken. Feuge literally became a synonym for bad. If someone objected to the constant demeaning of Israel in polite conversation, they were told, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish, whether they were or not. In the wave of Muslim-led lethal journalism-inspired Jew hatred that hit in late 2000, the European cultural Maginot Line crumbled. Much of this has to do, I think, with a remarkable Western, Christian and post-Christian appetite for stories about Jews behaving badly. Thus, the lethal narratives that Palestinians, as part of their war propaganda, told about Israel fed this moral schadenfreude, this palpable pleasure in the moral degradation of the Jews. You Jews, 2,000 years, you've been oppressed by other people, and no sooner do you get power than you turn around and do it to somebody else. And this attitude can take sadistic forms. You're no better. No, you're worse than the Nazis. Alas, at the turn of the new millennium, moral Europe and the global progressive left, all thinking they were the vanguard of global culture, moral culture, they were the moral vanguard of global culture, turned on Israel with a vengeance, preening in their moral superiority, all the sharper in contrast with an Israel that had, quote, lost the moral high ground. Thus, during the war in Lebanon in 2006, amid some profoundly unethical reporting, Norwegian author Jostein Gaarder wrote a virulent screed denouncing Israel's war crimes and focusing obsessively on the Jewish claim to being God's chosen people. There are limits to our patience, he wrote, and there are limits to our tolerance. We do not believe in divine promises as justification for occupation and apartheid. We have left the Middle Ages behind. We laugh uneasily at those who still believe that the God of flora and fauna and galaxies has selected one people in particular as his favorite and given it some funny stone tablets, burning bushes, and a license to kill. Having imbibed via his news media staged images of Israel's depravity, he speaks in the royal we for a global progressive left that feels itself morally authoritative and morally revolted. I think what we see at work here is a secular progressive supersessionism, whose replacement theology is that Israel is the new Nazi state, Palestinians are the new Jewish victims, and the global progressive left, the replacement of the Jews as the moral beacon of the world. Short of its secular disguise, it sounds a lot like Christian and Muslim supersessionism, and like them, this new voice bespeaks a profound moral insecurity. Other groups who claim they're God's chosen, and this gets back to Charles's point, other groups who claim they're God's chosen don't trigger such visceral reactions because they don't represent a moral challenge. For example, the Jihadis believe God has chosen them to kill. And yet, even though they are the enemies of Israel and Norway and every progressive secular society around, they don't even make it onto Jostein Gaarder's radar screen. Historically, this supersessionist Jew baiting, this desire to make oneself look good by dumping on Jews, has been relatively cost-free. But in the current conditions, those Westerners spreading these lethal narratives wave the flag of jihad in front of their Muslim communities. The French showed the picture of Mohammed Abdullah on their TV day after day after day after day. It was sort of the emblem. Al Jazeera and French TV sort of competed with how often this image was shown. The French had no idea that this was actually recruiting for jihad. Being a useful idiot in the 1920s for communism made a crazy kind of sense. The goodly vision of an egalitarian utopia carrying water for a distant regime. But what sense does it make to be a useful infidel in the 21st century? To remain attached to such poisonous propaganda offered up by a remorseless enemy seems pretty suicidal. Very rapidly, especially among that vocal crowd in whose collective voice Gaarder expressed contempt for Israel, a meta-message emerged. Israel is the world's misfortune, unser Unglück. Here I think of, is his name Imad Hamato?
Yeah.
Yeah, who says, if fish are fighting, if one fish eats another, it's because of the Jews. And incidentally, if you listen to Imad Hamato's speech, I think that, plenty of anti-Zionist progressives would say, yeah, he's right. He's absolutely right.
But they would say Israel, not the Jews.
They would say Israel, not the Jews. Durban 2001, a hate fest against the U.S. and Israel, the great and little Satans, all in the name of fighting racism, actually brought the human rights NGO movement in line with the jihadis, and this gets back to what Charles was saying about the corruption of the NGOs. Israel is the obstacle to global redemption, and if I had my PowerPoint, I'd show you a sign at one of these demonstrations saying, "Destroy Israel for world peace." The global progressive left, from the critical theorists like Judith Butler to the post-colonialists like Said and Tony Judd, have done their stampeding or been stampeded. The pacifist Butler, after the same wave of lethal journalism that triggered Gaarder's moral rant, somewhat reluctantly welcomed Hamas and Hezbollah into the ranks of the global progressive left because, she later explained, they are anti-imperialist. Mistaking as allies jihadist groups who will resist American imperialism only because it competes with their own more ferocious kind, constitutes an astonishing and elementary, indeed fatal error of judgment. Something common, however, amongst roosters. Indeed, so irrational has the GPL, the global progressive left, become in its hatred of both America and Israel that some have literally adopted the jihadi great and little Satan. I have an illustration, maybe I can get it, at the Denver Democratic Convention, people carrying a huge sign of anti-imperialist solidarity with Muqtada al-Sadr, who's one of the mosques that he was in control of had recently been captured, and there was evidence of torture in the basement of the mosque, but that didn't stop this sense of solidarity. If we wish to understand how successful jihad has been in its war against the West, I suggest we start here, in the shared hatred of a supersessionist Western global progressive left and a genocidal Muslim global right, jihadi right. If you wish to understand how much jihadi apocalyptic memes reach into the vast majority of moderate Muslims, according to our current president, 99% of the Muslim population, who have nothing to do with the violent extremism of those he won't call radical or violent Muslims, you could do no better than to trace the hostility of mainstream Muslim community to Jews. When Mohammed Merah kills Jewish schoolgirls in cold blood, it is more than the tiny minority of jihadis in France who glorify him as a hero. It's an extensive subculture of rappers and preachers, buoyed by a French cultural elite that turn over their patrimoine, like places like the Jeu de Paume, over to exhibitions that glorify the martyrs, the shaheeds that Itamar Marcus has just spoken to you about. And if you want to track how jihadi memes have penetrated the West, not only unopposed but supported by suicidal elements within our own culture, one need look no further than the kind of hate speech that characterizes Israel apartheid weeks and BDS movements, which most recently has managed to stampede an entire faculty at Connecticut College into reenacting the primitive scapegoat sacrifices described by René Girard, in which a Zionist professor, in the name of anti-hate speech and inclusion, became the victim of an ostracism that occasioned a new wave of anti-Zionist hate speech on campus. If Jews are leaving Europe today in unprecedented numbers, it's because a toxic combination of open hatred from Muslims, enabled and encouraged by quiet support from native Europeans, has made the situation increasingly untenable. And whatever one thinks today, I think it's fair to project that this situation will only get worse. What combination of the longue durée of resentment at Jews in European history, or just the fear of confronting Muslim hatreds this support comes from, we can't know, but we can, I think, know where it leads. It leads to a Judenrein Western Europe, right? And a Judenrein Western Europe is ripe for submission. Short of the destruction of the State of Israel, jihadis could imagine no initial goal more conducive to their plans for the conquest of Europe than to have Europeans acting like dhimmi even before they're conquered, allowing Muslims to drive Jews from their continent. What I would like to suggest in concluding is the following. If Western democracies hope to limit the destruction that this current forest fire of active cataclysmic apocalyptic will cause, if they wish to rebuild their crumbled Maginot Line, they need to A, confront the demon of Jew hatred that still lives among them, and to deal with the fact that one does not escape Holocaust guilt by hiding one's shame behind a new shaming of Israel, and B, use the presence of free Jews in the West and sovereign Jews in the Middle East as a test of moderate Islam, a shibboleth whereby we can know the kind of Meccan Muslims that Ayaan Hirsi Ali describes in her latest book, the kind of Muslims that we infidels can live with at peace in this coming global millennium, a millennium that will hopefully be one of universal human dignity and peace and prosperity. Thank you.